Hello, I am Megan Moyna. Today, my fellow group members Jenna Cowie and Beth Brooks and I will be presenting our group's 40/20 project. We set out to answer the question of how to manage wildlife in a non-urban area in a progressively urban landscape. This project set out to create a wildlife management plan for the Creighton Conservation Forest within the UNB woodlot. The University of New Brunswick obtained this land 200 years ago, and we would like to acknowledge that this land is the traditional territory of the Indigenous Wolastoqey First Nations people. The CCF is a 635-hectare forest on the edge of Fredericton's Southside Commercial District. It was newly designated in 2011 as a heritage conservation area within the larger UNB woodlot. It has 24 kilometers of trails for public recreation use, and as you can see from the figure behind me, the CCF is surrounded by forested areas and numerous areas of development, like the new Maryland suburbs in the lower left-hand corner and Southside Fredericton at the top of the map. It is surrounded by multiple highways that isolate and cut through the CCF, including being bisected by Highway 101. There is a total of 8.1 kilometers of streams within its borders, which are represented in blue. In this map, you can see there are a variety of forested areas in the CCF, including 12 unique community types, including spruce hemlock stands and inland wetlands that contribute to habitat and wildlife diversity. There are 85 hectares of inland wetland marshes and bogs, and is dominated by 50% softwood stands, 31% mixedwood stands, and 19% hardwood stands. In this presentation, we will be breaking down our process in creating this management plan. We broke it down into three main sections. We first outlined the dilemma of managing wildlife in an increasingly urban area by giving context to some of the problems that we faced and needed to consider, and how we developed our goals by evaluating stakeholders and their values. Context provides background on the area and helps support why management is needed in the first place. This includes historical influences and threats. Next, we will give a summary of our management plan. The main body of our management plan has a species-centric focus, using species as proxies, which means managing one species as an umbrella to protect multiple. We use 6 representative species, and we will be discussing the management of all of them. This also includes the management of vital features and their benefit to biodiversity. The last section details how to successfully implement the plan using the conditional management strategy and defining the importance of assessment, management actions, and monitoring, including examples from our plan. Prior to this project, there was no existing wildlife management plan or very little data that could be used to create one. We had to establish and build a foundation that could be worked off of and to create a solid plan that could be used by itself and be added to in the future. Since there was little data on species, we started by evaluating the past of the CCF. There is a rich history of site use and management practices that will continue into the future that have influenced these structures and wildlife that are present. The CCF was historically used for forestry education as opposed to environmental management and wildlife conservation initiatives, and since 1912 has been used for timber harvest as revenue. The university and the Maritime College of Forest and Technology have co-managed the woodlot, and since 1960, the MCFT has managed it, using it for teaching purposes, conducting research, and practicing silvicultural methods. Some of these practices include herbicide treatments, clear cutting, commercial thinning, and controlled burn treatments. For example, in this map here, we highlighted green areas which represent clear cuts, which takes up 14% of the total area of the CCF. Another change over time that has influenced the CCF has been development. Development has increased in intensity and proximity to the CCF over the past 50 years, with the average rate of development for big projects occurring every 15 to 20 years. The surrounding UNB woodlot has been used for recent development projects such as the Costco Center and the Knowledge Park Drive Business Park. According to the 2017 Fredericton Plan for Expansion, which is this map represented in this slide, the green circles highlight areas of targeted developmental growth. One of these circles in the lower part of this map contains part of the Corbett Brook. It is anticipated that New Maryland and Fredericton will continue expanding until eventually the CCF will be entirely surrounded by development, creating an island of nature in an urbanized sea. As this current forest is currently buffered by the UMB woodlot, as this buffer is reduced, it will limit the number of species that can access the CCF. The future development proposed by the City of Fredericton is projected to take up 260 hectares, which you can see in red in this map. Some of this directly borders the CCF on the western side. One challenge we faced was the process of determining our values and goals for this plan and considering the stakeholders while balancing the effective management of an abundance of species and being aware of the threats that are presented by encroaching urbanization. Defining values was important since it supports our goals and our reasoning for managing wildlife. The UMB Lands Management Plan defined the university's values for land to be conservation, education, recreation, and research. When defining values, we also needed to consider the stakeholders, which are demographic groups that have a vested interest in wildlife management within the CCF. Due to the differing site uses and interests that the CCF provides, stakeholders may have conflicting values pertaining to management. We identified these groups in this table. For example, the University of New Brunswick and MCFT were considered since they both use the CCF as an educational resource, and the public was considered a stakeholder since they use it as a recreational hub. By assessing what values each group holds most important, allowed us to determine better management goals and actions that considered various perspectives. As a group, we tried to evaluate what we thought these stakeholders would value the most, and then we conducted a management survey where we asked the stakeholders themselves what they thought was the most important value. From this assessment, we determined that conservation and education were the most important values. The CCF is defined as a heritage conservation area, but conservation is not clearly defined within the context of the CCF. As a group, we determined conservation to be promoting the development of a stable, diverse, and mature suburban forest that supports a diverse variety of wildlife. We also defined education as using the CCF for learning purposes, not only for forestry, but for environmental management and the promotion of sustainable practices. Once we established our values to be conservation, the most important part of the plan was to establish our goals and objectives so that they aligned with those values. The three main goals we developed were to create a usable framework for future management that could be applied to the conditions as they change, and to determine features important to species of concern, and set targets and thresholds for vital features to optimize desired conditions for wildlife in the CCF. Lastly, we wanted to consider trophic interactions and species ecology to determine which species can benefit from management and determine targets that are attainable using the vital features. Now that we had determined our goals and values, we need to determine an overall approach for the plan. We identified two approaches for managing wildlife: species-specific and habitat-specific. A species-centric model focused on developing actions that manage specific species and improving habitat conditions for that one species in the hopes of improving conditions for a wider range of species. The habitat-centric model focused on management actions in manipulating the habitat types in hopes of restoring wildlife populations. For example, reestablishing vegetation communities with the expectation that wildlife as a whole would recolonize. We ultimately chose to manage in a species-centric model, identifying specific species to manage for and changing habitat based on those needs. I will now hand it off to Jenna to explain our management plan and how we determined our management species.
Thank you, Megan. Having identified upwards of 20 mammal species, 10 amphibians, 2 reptiles, and 38 avian species, the most challenging part in developing a management plan was to decide which species to include. To do this, we decided to make a hierarchy of species. As a suburban forest with many influences, decreasing connectivity, and various stakeholders, we identified 4 categories of species that would be designated for management, and this includes species at risk, species of public or board interest, keystone species, or species capable of causing damage or altering the CCF. Species that did not fit into one of these categories were designated as species of not management concern and received no management actions. If species did fit into one of these 4 categories, we questioned if they would be in the CCF. If not, they were again classified as a species not of management concern. If they were, feasibility of management was considered. Would they be able to be conserved, managed, or influenced in a way by the CCF in which they should be targeted? If they could not be managed reasonably within the CCF, as in perhaps their range was too large or their management was a trade-off for other species, they were designated as a species of interest. This indicates species whose use of the CCF would be identified but not manipulated in any way. If species would be reasonably managed, they were designated as a species of management concern. This indicates species that would receive actions or manipulations to alter population or available habitat. Our last consideration, because of our ability to only include so many species, was that any categories or niches of species would not be duplicated, such as 2 diurnal raptors would not be included. Instead, we created a framework that could be used to mimic like species. With this strategy in mind, we narrowed down to 6 species of management concern. Over the next few slides, I will address each species niche and their management strategies. First is the beaver, who is a semi-aquatic species that requires aquatic resources, but is also unique in that it is an ecosystem engineer and can widely and largely affect the ecosystems within the CCF. Second is the white-tailed deer, who represents the large mammals and has the potential to be a nuisance herbivore by impacting the shrub and regeneration layer. It is also a species that is becoming more and more habituated to urban areas throughout New Brunswick. Third is the northern saw-whet owl, who is a nocturnal raptor and a migratory species that relies heavily on the small mammal populations within the CCF and also depends on cavity for nesting. Fourth is the northern goshawk, who is a diurnal raptor and an apex predator that influences and predates on many other species within the CCF. It is also a species of public concern because of potential impacts to recreationalists. Fifth is the Canada warbler, who is a passerine along with 22 other species identified in the CCF, but is more importantly a species at risk. Lastly is the pileated woodpecker, who is typically a mature forest specialist but also a keystone and umbrella species, upon which many other species depend. Although we were unable to include every species we would have liked, we believe that this group represents the strategies and niches that the CCF should be conserving. Habitat assessment has helped us to identify the presence, abundance, and distribution of vital features within the CCF. Habitat assessment has also indicated the distribution of various habitat types. Combining knowledge of soil, successional stage, and composition can indicate the likely distribution of various species. Understanding available habitat has helped create population targets and identify important overlapping habitat, as you can see in this map. Over the next few slides, I'll address the targets and management of the 6 species of management concern. Beaver is a species of management concern because of its confirmed presence in the CCF and its influence on habitat alteration and potential damage to human infrastructure. This is an image of a beaver lodge that was located in 2020 that was active. It is indicated by the green circle in the map. Management actions focus on reducing conflict related to beaver populations by regulating water levels with the Creighton water leveler, which is indicated by the stars on the map. Food availability and management through assessment, designation of prime habitat, and encouragement of regeneration of preferred species is also recommended to maintain the target colony size. Historically, there have been higher populations of 20 to 25 beavers. Signs demonstrating historic distribution are indicated by the red circles in the map. Their presence resulted in flooding, infrastructure damage, and stakeholder conflict. The target population for beaver is one colony, which can contain 2 to 8 individuals. There are 245 hectares of potential habitat based on the preferred tree species, ideal for beaver. 9.3 hectares of this potential habitat was defined as primary habitat due to the proximity to water and food availability. Deer was identified as a species of management concern due to its presence and lack of information on winter habitat use in the CCF and its potential to degrade important understory habitat. This was identified as a concern in the CCF as population reduction, such as hunting or exclusion via fencing, is not feasible or permitted. Deer have high public value for both positive and negative reasons. Deer sightings within the CCF are positively viewed by the public who use the woodlot, but in high numbers they can result in potential collisions on the highways and main roads surrounding the CCF, with an average of 4 collisions per year from 2017 to 2020. To manage deer in the CCF, potential wintering habitat was identified, as indicated by this map. The habitat needs to be surveyed to determine population density of overwintering deer within the CCF. Once habitat use is determined, the AVID survey will be used to determine their impact on understory vegetation. The population density for deer is recommended at a maximum of 0.149 individuals per hectare. In addition, 160 hectares have been identified as target habitat for deer that contain sites for deer yarding in the winter and habitat that contains enough browse to support target population without habitat degradation. A resident northern goshawk was displaying territorial behavior in the CCF in 2020. Because the CCF is shared with many recreationalists, it is important to consider ways to increase safety for both wildlife and people. Goshawk management is focused on the identification of its actively used nest sites, which can be up to 8 separate sites and can change annually, and also to improve recreationalist safety. The population target is to maintain one breeding pair of 2 individuals. This includes 115 hectares of primary foraging and nesting habitat, as seen in this map. Vital features associated with foraging habitat include the target of 19 prey items per hectare. The vital features associated with nesting habitat include the 300-meter buffer around surrounding active nest sites. The northern saw-whet owl is a nocturnal predator and a migratory species within the CCF. As a suburban area, this charismatic species has conservation value to public stakeholders. The assessment and monitoring of this species can indicate important population trends. As a cavity nester, this species is a direct competitor with other cavity nesting species who value snags. To decrease competition with other cavity nesters, nest box sites have been recommended, which are indicated on the map. These locations have been selected with consideration of the location of the northern goshawk active nesting site. An annual call survey protocol has also been developed to monitor the population. The population target for northern saw-whet owls is 1 breeding pair. The spatial target is 75 hectares of primary habitat, which includes the target threshold of vital features. This includes nesting cavities, which could be provided by having 6 snags over 30 centimeters DBH per hectare. But we've decided to ensure that that's available with the implementation of 3 nest boxes. And secondary is forage, which is targeted at 19 prey species per hectare. The Canada warbler is a threatened species. Using citizen science, a photo of a male Canada warbler, which can be seen on screen, was captured. This allowed us to get the georeference data for the photograph and determine the exact location of the sighting. Management actions for the Canada warbler are focused on the habitat improvement after the assessment of quality of perches and available cover. After classification of habitat using the Atlantic Canada Ecosystem Key, it was determined that the appropriate forest composition for Canada warbler habitat consists of 45 hectares of primary habitat that include the vital features threshold of 12 perches per hectare and 40 to 70% understory foliage cover. Because of its designation as a species at risk, we have designated this primary habitat as an area of high conservation value to receive complete conservation. The pileated woodpecker was observed within the CCF through citizen science data, although the current population is unknown. This map indicates the monitoring protocol to survey the population to determine subsequent management actions. The pileated woodpecker are a keystone species in that they are primary cavity excavators, upon which many other cavity nesting species depend. Maintaining a population will help support the conservation of biodiversity in the CCF. The population target for pileated woodpecker is 2 breeding pairs with 50 hectares of primary habitat, including vital features. The vital habitat features required by pileated woodpeckers include nesting sites, which include snags of class 4 or greater, over 30 centimeters dBH, at a density of 6 per hectare, and foraging, which includes carpenter ants and saprophilic insects. Surveys have been developed to assess each of these, and management actions focus on increasing these features if they do not meet the target thresholds. Next, Beth will be explaining vital wildlife habitat features within the CCF and protocols and examples for assessment, actions, and monitoring.
Thanks, Jenna. When managing species, there's more to consider than just the forest composition, and colonization of an area by desirable species often requires the presence of specific structural features. We determined that we needed to assess, and in some cases implement protection, for geological features, vernal pools, riparian areas, snags, and coarse woody debris. Geological features have been identified in the northeastern portion of the CCF and provide unique structural diversity, which is important to biodiversity maintenance. To prevent degradation, we have designated a 30-meter buffer from development and trail creation. Vernal pools are aquatic features that are seasonally temporary, but can persist year to year in the landscape. After ground truthing identification, they're going to be protected by a 5-meter buffer. Riparian zones are provincially protected and have legally designated 30-meter buffers, which is displayed on screen. Snags and coarse woody debris are terms used to define residual matter left after trees die. Due to their short-term persistence in the landscape, they are not provided buffers, but are still considered important parts of the ecosystem. Vernal pools, snags, and coarse woody debris might be subject to spatial distribution changes and require continued assessment and monitoring. Vernal pools are important breeding habitat for many amphibian species, and 131 have been remotely identified using LiDAR digital elevation models, which were created in 2017. They should be re-verified every 5 years to determine vernal pool quality and use. Next is snags. An intensive preliminary survey should be completed to indicate the classification, abundance, and distribution of snags throughout the CCF, and they should then be reassessed every 5 years. Lastly, coarse woody debris, which is vital habitat to saprophilic insects and small mammals, will be surveyed in each primary habitat type every 5 years. The 5 discussed vital features provide habitat and structural diversity to many wildlife species within the CCF, either directly or indirectly. Monitoring these features and ensuring they are high quality and at the recommended abundance and distribution will facilitate conservation. For us to succeed in developing a usable management plan, we had to make sure the plan could adapt as conditions change. Effective management is dependent on an in-depth understanding of current conditions in order to determine the next best step. A management ladder was developed for each species of management concern, outlining the appropriate methodology depending on the current state of the landscape. It is important to assess the conditions, complete the management actions, and then continually monitor for changes in order to gain the best outcome. I would like to go through the beaver conditional management strategy with you as an example. First, a population assessment needs to be completed. What are the population levels of beaver? Do they meet the target? Is the population above or below the target? population does meet the target of one colony, the monitoring for changes is the appropriate next action. Things become more complicated if the population is either above or below the appropriate threshold. If the population is above target levels, the Capstone leveler should be installed to stabilize water levels and limit flooding. If the population is below, then the vital feature should be assessed in order to determine the limiting factor. Lastly, if the habitat meets the appropriate thresholds but the population is still below the target, it needs to be monitored. This likely means that there is some other reason for the beaver's low population levels that do not relate to water levels or food availability. If habitat is assessed and is determined that there is a lack of available resources, then there should be selective softwood removal in key locations in order to encourage aspen and deciduous recruitment and boost food resource availability. Assessment is the first step in active management. Before you influence conditions, you need to understand the current environmental state. We have developed assessment protocols for all 6 species and their associated vital features. This comes out to a total of 16 assessments, 10 of which can be seen on screen. Included is the survey, a description of the activities, and the appropriate season. After completion of an assessment, the results should be compared to the associated targets and thresholds in order to determine the extent of which management actions need to be undertaken. An example of assessments includes Canada warbler habitat assessment. In part, Canada warbler habitat is defined and characterized as possessing 12 perches per hectare and an understover quarry of 40 to 70%. In this context, a perch is defined as an area that has 5 meters of visibility and is 3 to 8 meters in height. Small snags, less than 10 centimeters in DBH, or defoliated shrubs are often used. A foliage volume of 40 to 70% is required to maintain sufficient cover for Canada warbler. Both perches and understories should be assessed within the 25 1.5 hectare feature monitoring plots, which are the red rings on screen. If it is determined that the resources present are inadequate when compared to the aforementioned thresholds, then management actions should be undertaken to increase habitat quality. Management actions are implemented after conditions have been assessed. In order to be prepared, we have assumed that all conditions will be determined as subpar and fully developed management protocols. Realistically, some of these assessments will determine that the thresholds are met and thus management actions are unnecessary, but we are prepared. The first couple of years of management are the most extensive regarding the actions that might need to be undertaken. We have provided the management actions scheduled for the first and second years on screen. We completed an alternative analysis, including feasibility and cost, in order to determine the best method of management for that specific feature of interest. An example of a management action is the installation of saw-wet nesting boxes. Installation of nesting boxes is an immediate habitat improvement for the saw-wet, which are secondary cavity nesters. Locations for the nesting boxes have been chosen with habitat heterogeneity and proximity to riparian areas in mind, both of which are known to positively influence prey availability. Nesting boxes are projected to cost $360 with an annual maintenance cost of $50 and 8 hours of effort. The nesting boxes will need to be placed 12 feet above the ground on a south-facing aspect of a mature conifer. Monitoring is a vital portion of successful management and is needed to evaluate conditions and observe trends in the long term. Completing monitoring in the CCF offers a number of opportunities for education by partnering with UNB and MCFT. The regular monitoring activities could be used as parts of a curriculum and offer hands-on experience for upcoming natural resource professionals. We scheduled monitoring activities within a 10-year plan, which follows the recommended interval of every single survey to create a comprehensive list. This is a snapshot of our highest priority monitoring activities that occur on years 2, 6, and 10. Example of monitoring includes the annual goshawk nesting site survey. The purpose of monitoring goshawk is to identify actively used nesting sites and observe trends. Goshawk monitoring occurs in the spring from March to April and utilizes goshawk calls played from a specific set of points, which you can see on screen. This can be used to triangulate nesting locations. The survey must start half an hour before sunrise during peak activity, and while standing still for 10 minutes on an early March morning makes for a chilly time, it is valuable to detect goshawk nesting sites, which the knowledge is important to both conservation and research and recreation within the CCF. After today's presentation, we hope you have an understanding of how we manage non-urban wildlife in a progressively urban landscape. The first part of our plan was creating a solid foundation, making deliberate choices regarding our goals and how we adhere to stakeholder values. Next, we carefully selected species of management concern, studied their vital features, and developed a plan for positively influencing habitat to encourage occupation. Finally, we developed a conditional management strategy, utilizing assess, action, and monitor to create a functioning plan, regardless of how conditions may change. Thank you for attending, and we'd be happy to take any questions.